Hi there. I hope you're doing well. Today I want to talk about a subject that has surprising importance in our society and something that definitely falls under the category of deviant behavior, suicide, chapter 10 of Clenard and Meyer's book. It's a serious topic and also something to think about in terms of policies, how people might be helped, and something that affects a great number of people. I'm going to break this into two different sections, part one and part two, so that I can discuss more of the text with you in a little more depth and you can watch those at your leisure. The first part of this discussion in your textbook talks about different people who've killed themselves for different reasons. It said a woman, Karen Smith, had been assaulted by three teenage boys after falling asleep during a drinking episode, and she was devastated and decided to end her life. Another fellow, Sir Edward Downes, found out he was in the last stages of terminal cancer and also decided to die with his wife, who had been ailing for more than 50 years. Robin Williams is mentioned. Perhaps you know Robin Williams, the comedian. Says it seemed he had everything going for him, suffered from depression, and might have been part of why he decided to end his life. However, they point out it's not true that all depressed people are suicidal, which is an important thing to consider. On the next page, it says what I have here on your PowerPoint. Suicide takes place among all age groups, teens, middle-aged, and the elderly, though not at the same rates, which we'll talk about, of course, here. Suicide, should be noted too, is a process. It isn't just a single act. It's something that varies, as mentioned, between groups, situations, and time periods or eras. The World Health Organization, according to the text, it says there are 900,000 suicides a year in the world, so nearly 1 million. And it says too, it is the third leading cause of death in the United States for people 15 to 24 years of age. And that's something to think about, considering the fact that young people are healthy, generally speaking, and so it's the third cause of death. It also defines suicide, the intentional and deliberate destruction of a person's life. It says it's always an intentional act. That's implied in the definition. And they may do this for many different reasons, some of which we'll discuss. Among Japanese nobility, you could do it because of social obligations rather than a voluntary choice. So samurai warriors would commit harikari, which we'll talk about. Euthanasia, the desire to avoid suffering, and so suicide for that purpose. And there should be some distinguishing, according to your text, between people who commit relatively fast suicide, but then also perhaps people who kill themselves over a long period of time, sometimes thought of as indirect suicide. So people who drink for decades, who smoke perhaps could be categorized in this way. And it says that corresponds with more than a quarter of all suicides end lives of heavy alcohol use or follow intensive drinking bouts. As mentioned a second ago, euthanasia is a suicide motivated by the desire to avoid suffering. So the idea of physician-assisted suicide has been popularized in the United States, and several states, including Oregon and Washington, now allow for physician-assisted suicide, euthanasia. There are also deaths caused by actions without immediate lethal suicide consequences. So, like mentioned before, the personal histories of drinking can be very substantial in terms of a person's death, and those are intentional acts. So, perhaps something to be categorized under suicide, though many coroners might not regard those as suicide. And that's another topic, how deaths are classified, that we'll be getting into here. Most countries have always and continue to condemn suicide. So societies with Western European backgrounds and Islamic countries also carry stigma against people who have committed suicide in some instances. And it says in your text, there are other countries that are exceptions. Asian people in the past, suti, suicide by a widow throwing herself onto a husband's funeral pyre, was a common occurrence in India well into the 19th century. Chinese society formally accepted suicide as an effective tool of revenge against an enemy because it embarrassed them. And as mentioned a minute ago, for many countries, people in Japan regarded suicide favorably in some situations. Harikari, the term developed over 1,000 years ago, a ceremonial form of suicide to avoid capture after a military defeat. So suicide was more honorable than capture. And then later it gained the status of an appropriate response to condemnation by superiors. So nobility, if they were accused of crime, sedition crime, had a choice to die by harikari or by public execution, and often would choose harikari. These are discussed here also in this particular slide, the same things I've mentioned before. The practice of widows throwing themselves on funeral pyres, was prohibited in 1829. Suicide today, public attitudes generally condemn it in the United States. No European country, though, including the Soviet Union, legally prohibits it. It used to be legally prohibited. There is social acceptance or condemnation of suicide varying and depending on many characteristics. So the religious background of someone, the educational level they have, all of those things may indicate variation in public attitude towards suicide. Here are some facts from your text. Religious orientations in the Middle Ages led to people like St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas saying that suicide was against God and therefore should be very much stigmatized. The Enlightenment came along, though, stressing individual freedom, and so theorists like Montesquieu, Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau challenged laws on suicide as denials of individual choice. English punished suicide as a felony for centuries, only abolishing those laws in 1870. And it said in Massachusetts, in early America, a law there forbade interring a suicide into a common burying place of Christians, meaning that people who killed themselves couldn't be buried in Christian cemeteries. Talking about attempted suicide, suicides may, at least in terms of attempts, may number as many as 20 times the number of successful suicides. So that's an amazing thing to consider, that there are 20 attempts for every one successful suicide. Most suicide attempts occur in settings that encourage or at least allow intervention by others. So the attempt might be in a public place or with the person knowing that others might find them, in some kind of a situation where there might be a good cause or a good case where somebody might intervene. Women attempt more than men, and for better or worse, men are more successful. So your text here mentions a profile of the typical suicide attempter, a native-born white female in her 20s or 30s, married housewife or single woman, not someone divorced or separated, and that person taking an overdose of barbiturates. The typical successful suicide was a married native-born white male in his 40s or older, skilled or unskilled worker, ending his life by gunshot, hanging, or carbon monoxide poisoning to escape problems with ill health, depression, marital difficulties. There are problems, though, you could clearly say, with finding statistics on suicide. It's underreported by local and state agencies. The coroner also has an important role in labeling this as a suicide or some other cause of death. The coroner may not identify the death as a suicide, perhaps through social pressure or some other factors, while other people may record it another way. Let's say, for example, someone drives a car into a building. If they leave a suicide note, then that may be classified as a suicide. If they don't, that may be recorded as an accident. So sometimes it's in the eye of the interpreter. Also, too, there may be, it says, a cover-up by family and friends to make sure that a death does not appear as a suicide because of the stigma that may be associated with it. Actually, I was just thinking, if you go back to France in the Middle Ages, anyone who might kill themselves would be seen as doing something against the king, and therefore they might, say, drag that person through the streets naked on a horse, or I should say a horse would drag them through the streets. It wasn't uncommon back then. If you're talking about rates, you can say the U.S. has held fairly stable rates in the last few decades, between 11 to 12 suicides per 100,000 people, and that's something from 2009. The suicide rate may fluctuate with economic changes, and it may fluctuate during wartime. So, for example, the Great Depression, there was a much higher suicide rate, 17.4 per 100,000. And it says during World War II, rates declined 20 to 50%. Now, why might that be? It's an interesting thing to consider sociologically. One of them may be that the public feels unified against a common enemy. And that might be a good reason to think, I should continue to live. We're all in this together. It also says, though, that war might bring abundant economic opportunity, new jobs for people, which gives them a sense of purpose. Suicide rates differ substantially among countries, as well as within and between social categories, age, sex, and race, for example. And contrary to popular belief, suicides decline around major national holidays. Rates decline before, during, and after Memorial Day, Thanksgiving, and Christmas, and decline before and after New Year's, the 4th of July, and Labor Day, according to one study in 1987. Military suicide rates. These have paralleled civilian rates until recently, and they've been increasing since the beginning of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. People perhaps coming back with PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome disorder from those horrific wars. A question for you. Males tend to use more dangerous or immediate lethal means, such as firearms, while females favor more often chemicals or knives. Is this true or false? As we've been discussing here, this is true. So now we can talk about differences by demographic category, gender differences. As mentioned, males tend to use dangerous or immediately lethal means, firearms typically. Women tend to use chemicals, drugs, knives. Okay, let's try a question. Married people commit suicide at lower rates than single, divorced, or widowed people. True or false? If you think about earlier discussions about Durkheim and the idea of social integration, and that means that you would avoid anomie, you should be able to think through this answer pretty readily. Married people commit suicide at lower rates. Absolutely true. So, considering the extent of suicide, you can look at all sorts of things. Under race, whites kill themselves at substantially higher rates than occurring among African Americans. Married people commit suicide at lower rates, as previously discussed, and that includes single, divorced, or widowed people. All of those have higher rates. religion, suicide rates of Catholics tend to fall below those of Protestants. And you can see Emil Durkheim's work related to that. It says here, the suicide rates of Catholics fall below that of Protestants, although this differential has diminished. It also says in recent years, Jewish suicide rates have risen considerably. In consideration of occupation and social status, it says there's an inverse relationship between suicide and education. The least educated person is twice as likely than the most educated to commit suicide. Now, what is interesting in your text is that Durkheim seemed to think the opposite. He noted that it occurs unusually frequently among people in the upper ranks of social occupations. However, that has been negated by this study, which is much more recent, 1973, which says exactly what your PowerPoint slide says there. Also, too, occupational status alone does not effectively predict suicide. Emil Durkheim wanted to look at suicide in traditional pre-literate societies. So he came up with a categorization scheme for those. And he saw pre-literate societies as more integrated. And so he said the types of suicides there would be different from a literate society and advanced industrial society like the one he was in. So he looked at this suicide as a result of the degree of social interaction and regulation in a society. The prevalence of group unity and the strengths of ties binding people together greatly informed the occurrence of suicide. And he said that suicide is not an individual phenomenon, but a consequence of social organization as well as social structure.